Elena Mercer stood in the frozen mud outside Ironvale Ranch with $17, a worn trunk, and nowhere left to run. The men who'd gathered to watch her arrival didn't bother hiding their smirks, another city woman about to break against the frontier. But Elena had already buried a husband, lost a home to vultures in fine suits, and spent 3 weeks traveling west with nothing but spite keeping her warm. She wasn't here to be rescued. She was here because Rhett Colson's telegram had offered one thing no one else would: a chance. And if these ranch hands thought a 43-year-old widow would crumble at the sight of hard work, they were about to learn what grief could forge out of a woman who had nothing left to lose. If you want to see how far a woman can go when the world bets against her, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. The stagecoach lurched to a stop, and Elena's stomach dropped with it. Through the dust-caked window, Blackthorn Ridge looked like something spit out by the earth itself. A collection of weathered buildings hunched against an endless gray sky, surrounded by nothing but frozen plains and the kind of wind that found every gap in your clothing. This was it, the last stop on a line of failures that stretched all the way back to Philadelphia. She climbed down carefully, her boots sinking into half-frozen mud. The driver tossed her trunk down without ceremony, tipped his hat without warmth, and was gone before she'd fully caught her balance. The cold hit her immediately, sharper than anything she'd felt back east, the kind that made your lungs ache. A small crowd had gathered outside the general store. 3 men in heavy coats, a woman in an apron, a boy no older than 12. All of them watching. Elena straightened her spine and lifted her chin. She'd learned young that posture could lie when everything else told the truth. Let them look. She had $17, a letter of employment from a man she'd never met, and no plan beyond surviving the next 24 hours. The general store was dim and smelled of tobacco and old wood. The man behind the counter looked her over with the particular assessment men gave to women alone, calculating worth, measuring trouble. Help you? I'm looking for directions to Ironvale Ranch. I'm expected. His eyebrows went up. You're the cook Colson hired? I am. He didn't laugh, but something in his expression suggested he wanted to. Ranch is 8 miles northeast, road's clear enough if you've got a wagon. I don't. Then you've got a problem. He jerked his chin toward the window. Otis Fletcher runs a livery 2 buildings down. Might rent you something. Might not. Elena thanked him and left before he could offer any more of his particular brand of help. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the smell of snow that hadn't fallen yet. She could feel eyes on her back as she walked toward the livery, could practically hear the bets being placed on how long she'd last. The livery was warmer, thick with the smell of horses and hay. A man in his 50s looked up from a saddle he was mending, took in her city clothes and worn gloves, and went back to his work. Mr. Fletcher? That's right. I need to rent a wagon to get to Ironvale Ranch. Don't rent wagons. He didn't look up. Sell them, board horses. Fix tack. Don't rent. Elena counted to 3, slow and deliberate, the way she used to when her husband would come home drunk and spoiling for a fight. What would you suggest I do then? Wait for the supply run next week. Colson sends a man in every Monday. I'm expected today. That got his attention. He looked at her properly now, something shifting in his face. You're the widow he hired. It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. I am. Fletcher set down the saddle and stood, wiping his hands on his pants. He was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away. She didn't. How much you weighing, if you don't mind my asking? I mind, but I understand the question. Enough to need a sturdy horse, not enough to need a draft. The corner of his mouth twitched. Might have been a smile on a friendlier face. Wait here. He disappeared into the back and returned leading a solid bay mare with intelligent eyes and a patient demeanor. This is Nell. She'll get you there. $20 deposit, return her by week's end, and you'll get $15 back. Elena had $17 total. 5 would leave her with nothing if the ranch didn't work out. But standing in Blackthorn Ridge wasn't getting her any closer to employment, and she'd already learned that sometimes you had to bet everything just to stay in the game. I'll take her. Fletcher helped her secure the trunk behind the saddle, her entire life reduced to what could fit in a box 2 feet long. As she mounted, he surprised her by speaking again. Fair warning about Colson. He's a hard man running a hard outfit. Lost his wife and baby daughter to fever 4 years back, and hasn't been the same since. Runs that ranch like a military operation. You cross him or can't keep pace, he'll send you back faster than you arrived. Elena gathered the reins. I appreciate the warning. You know how to handle a horse? Well enough. Storm's coming in tonight. You see the sky change, you find shelter fast. Don't try to outrun weather out here. You'll lose. She nodded and turned Nell toward the northeast road. Behind her, she heard Fletcher call out, Good luck, Mrs. Mercer. She didn't look back. The ride was harder than she'd expected. The road was barely a road at all, more a suggestion worn into the prairie by years of wagon wheels. The wind came in gusts that made Nell's ears flick back in irritation, and the cold worked its way through Elena's coat until her hands ached even inside her gloves. The landscape was relentless in its emptiness. No trees, no hills, just endless frozen grass and sky that seemed to press down like a weight. She'd grown up in Philadelphia, where buildings blocked the wind and you were never more than a block from warmth and noise. Then she'd married Thomas Mercer, a clerk with charm and ambition and a weakness for card games. For 17 years, she'd made a home, managed a household, turned his modest salary into something resembling comfort. And then Thomas died. Sudden, stupid, a heart that gave out at 41, and the debts came crawling out like roaches. His business partner had been sympathetic right up until he wasn't. The house had to be sold, the furniture auctioned, her own sister had offered her a room in Boston with the kind of pity that felt like acid, a place at the table in exchange for becoming a live-in servant for her brother-in-law's expanding family. Elena had smiled and declined and spent her last savings on a westward ticket instead. She'd answered 7 advertisements for household positions. 6 never wrote back. The 7th was Rhett Colson's blunt 3-sentence telegram. Need experienced cook for remote ranch. Hard work, simple pay, room and board. 1-week trial. Wire reply. It wasn't kindness. It wasn't even opportunity, really. But it was a door that hadn't slammed in her face, and that was enough. The ranch appeared just as the light was starting to fail. A collection of low buildings arranged around a central yard, everything built for function rather than beauty. The main house was larger than the others, 2 stories of rough timber with smoke rising from a stone chimney. To the left, a long bunkhouse. To the right, a massive barn and several smaller outbuildings. Corrals spread out behind, and even from a distance she could see horses and cattle. 3 men were working near the barn, their movements efficient and unhurried. They looked up as she rode in, and one of them, a younger man with a crooked nose, nudged the others and said something that made them all turn to stare. Elena dismounted, her legs unsteady after hours in the saddle. She tied Nell to the post outside the main house, retrieved her trunk with hands that had gone clumsy from cold, and walked up the 3 steps to the porch. The door opened before she could knock. The man who stood there was tall and broad-shouldered, probably mid-40s, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and a face that looked like it had forgotten how to rest. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, and they assessed her with the same cool detachment Fletcher had shown, but sharper, more final. Mrs. Mercer. Mr. Colson. You're late. The stage arrived on time. Blackthorn Ridge doesn't rent wagons. He stepped back without comment, holding the door. She entered a room that was clean and sparse. A stone fireplace, a heavy wooden table, chairs that had seen hard use, and not a single item that wasn't strictly necessary. No curtains, no rugs, no photographs. A place someone lived in without actually living. You'll sleep in the back room off the kitchen, Colson said, already moving deeper into the house. Meals are at 6, noon, and 6. Breakfast is simple, biscuits, bacon, coffee, oats if there's time. Noon is whatever can be prepared fast and eaten standing. Supper needs to be hot and enough for 12 men who've worked since dawn. We don't waste food and we don't tolerate complaints. You have questions? Elena set her trunk down carefully, buying herself a moment. His tone wasn't cruel exactly, but it wasn't warm either. This was a business transaction, and he was making the terms clear. How many ranch hands currently? 10, plus myself and my foreman, Wade Brennan. Some rotate out to line camps depending on season, but you cook for 12 unless I tell you different. Dietary restrictions? That almost got a reaction. His eyebrow twitched slightly. They eat what you make or they don't eat. Understood. Supplies? Root cellar is stocked. Smokehouse has what we need through winter. Supply run to town every Monday if you need something specific. but don't expect luxuries. He led her through to the kitchen, and Elena had to work not to let her face show what she was thinking. The room was functional but grim. A massive cast-iron stove that looked older than she was, a work table scarred by years of use, open shelves holding mismatched plates and cups, and a distinct smell of burnt grease and resignation. The window over the dry sink looked out toward the barn, and the floor was clean but unswept. This was where someone had given up. Your room. Coulson pushed open a narrow door to reveal a space barely large enough for a bed and a trunk. A single window, a peg for hanging clothes, a washstand. It was cold and plain and more than she'd had a right to expect. It's fine. You start tomorrow at 5. I'll expect biscuits and coffee ready when the men come in at 6. Wade will go over expectations for the other meals. He turned to leave, then paused. I'm giving you 1 week, Mrs. Mercer. If you can't manage the work, or if the men complain about the food, I'll pay your return fare to Blackthorn Ridge and we'll part ways. I need someone competent, not someone learning on my time. Elena met his eyes. I understand. Do you? For the first time, something other than cold assessment crossed his face. Not quite doubt, but close. This isn't Philadelphia. We're 8 miles from town in country that kills people who don't respect it. The work is hard, the hours are long, and nobody here has time to nursemaid anyone, including you. If you're expecting courtesy or second chances, you're in the wrong place. I'm not expecting anything, Mr. Coulson. I'm here to work. He studied her for another long moment, then gave a single nod. Supper is in an hour. Men eat in the dining hall attached to the bunkhouse. You'll find it through that door. He pointed to the far side of the kitchen. Serving pans are on the shelf. Don't be late. Then he was gone, his boots heavy on the wooden floor, the front door closing behind him with finality. Elena stood alone in the kitchen and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of panic. The stove was enormous and unfamiliar. The supplies were a mystery. She had an hour to produce a meal for 12 men who were probably expecting her to fail, and her hands were still numb from the cold. 30 seconds. Then she got to work. The root cellar was accessed through a trapdoor in the kitchen floor, a dark, cold space that smelled of earth and potatoes. She found onions, carrots, turnips, a few wrinkled apples. The smokehouse yielded a side of bacon and several links of sausage. In the pantry, she discovered flour, lard, salt, dried beans, and a jar of sourdough starter that looked like it had been neglected but was still alive. Not much to work with, but she'd made meals from less. She got the stove going, fighting with the damper until she figured out its particular temperament and started water boiling. Beans would take too long, but she could make a thick soup with the sausage, root vegetables, and some of the bacon for fat. Biscuits were simple enough if the starter was good, and if she fried the remaining bacon crisp, at least there'd be something with texture. Her hands warmed as she worked, muscle memory taking over. Chop the vegetables even. Keep the soup from scorching. Test the oven temperature with a flick of water on the iron. Mix the biscuit dough quick and light. Don't overwork it. This was familiar territory, the only territory where she'd ever felt completely certain. The men started arriving before she was ready. She heard them coming through the connecting door, voices rough and tired, chairs scraping against wood. Someone laughed at something, the sound sharp and sudden in the cold air. Elena wiped her hands on her apron, lifted the soup pot, heavier than she'd expected, her arms straining, and carried it through. The dining hall was long and plain, with 2 tables running its length and benches on either side. 12 men looked up as she entered, their conversations dying mid-sentence. She could feel the weight of their attention, the snap judgments being made. She set the pot down on the serving counter, went back for the biscuits and bacon, and arranged everything without comment. Then she stepped back and waited. Coulson entered last, Wade Brennan beside him, an older man with silver hair and a weathered face that suggested he'd seen everything twice. They took seats at the head of the near table, and the rest of the men followed their lead, lining up to fill their bowls. The first man to taste the soup was a stocky ranch hand with a scar across his knuckles. He took a spoonful, chewed thoughtfully, and then went back for another without expression. Elena watched as the bowls emptied, as the biscuits disappeared, as the bacon vanished. Nobody spoke to her. Nobody complained, but nobody complimented either. They ate like men who needed fuel, efficiently and without ceremony, and when they were finished, they filed back out the way they'd come. Coulson was the last to leave. He paused at the door, his bowl empty, and gave her a single nod. Not approval, just acknowledgement that she'd cleared the first low bar. Then she was alone with a stack of dirty dishes and a stove that needed banking for the night. She washed every dish, scrubbed every pot, swept the floor, and wiped down the surfaces. By the time she finished, her back ached and her hands were raw, but the kitchen was cleaner than it had been when she'd arrived. She checked the stove one last time, made sure the damper was set correctly, and finally allowed herself to collapse onto the narrow bed in her small room. The wind rattled the window. Somewhere outside, a horse whinnied. The house settled around her with creaks and groans. Elena stared at the ceiling and thought about Thomas, about the house in Philadelphia, about her sister's pitying smile. She thought about the men who'd watched her tonight like she was a problem waiting to happen. Then she thought about Coulson's words. 1 week. She'd survived worse than doubt. She'd bury a husband, lose everything, and travel 1,000 miles west with nothing but stubbornness keeping her vertical. A week was nothing. A week was easy. She closed her eyes and slept like the dead. The alarm was the cold. Elena woke in darkness, her breath misting in the air, every muscle stiff from the previous day's ride and the unfamiliar bed. For a moment she couldn't remember where she was, and then it all came back in a rush. The ranch, the kitchen, the test. She dressed quickly in the dark, layering everything she owned against the cold, and made her way to the kitchen. The stove was barely warm. She rebuilt the fire with hands that fumbled in the pre-dawn darkness, cursing softly when the kindling wouldn't catch, finally getting it going through sheer determination. Coffee first. She found the grounds, measured them out, got water heating. While it brewed, she started on the biscuits, flour, starter, lard, a pinch of salt. Mix it fast and gentle, cut them out, and get them in the oven before the chemistry stopped working. The bacon went into a cast iron skillet, filling the kitchen with the smell of smoke and fat. She scrambled 24 eggs in the bacon grease, knowing instinctively that ranchmen would want substance over delicacy. By the time boots sounded on the porch, she had everything ready. The men filed in silent and half asleep, poured coffee, loaded their plates, and ate without comment. Coulson appeared, filled a cup, took a biscuit, and left without a word. The first test was passed. Barely. The days that followed blurred together into a relentless rhythm. Up before dawn, coffee and biscuits, clean the kitchen, start preparing the noon meal while the morning dishes were still drying, serve 12 men who never said thank you and rarely looked at her directly. Clean again. Start supper, serve, clean, collapse into bed and do it all again the next day. The stove fought her constantly. It ran too hot or too cold, the oven temperature was a guess, and the damper seemed to have a mind of its own. She burned a pan of cornbread on the third day and had to serve it anyway, scraping off the worst of the char and pretending not to notice the looks the men exchanged. On the fourth day, she overcooked the beef until it was tough and gray, and one of the younger ranch hands, a cocky kid named Davis, made a show of sawing at it with his knife. "Might be easier to just chew the plate, ma'am," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. The table went quiet. Elena felt heat crawl up her neck, felt the familiar sting of humiliation, the weight of being judged and found wanting. Every eye was on her, waiting to see if she'd break. She looked directly at Davis and kept her voice level. "Then I suggest you eat faster tomorrow before I have time to ruin it." Someone snorted. Might have been Wade. Davis flushed red and went back to his meal without another word. But Elena lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, knowing she was losing ground. The food was passable, but not good. The men tolerated her, but didn't trust her. And Coulson watched everything with those cold, assessing eyes, counting down the days until he could send her back to Blackthorn Ridge with a clear conscience. On the fifth morning, she woke to voices shouting outside. She pulled on her coat and stepped onto the porch to find chaos in the yard. A horse was loose, bucking and wild-eyed, and 3 men were trying to corner it while the others yelled directions. In the confusion, one of the ranch hands, a quiet man named Pruitt, got too close and the horse lashed out, catching him square in the shoulder and sending him sprawling into the frozen mud. He didn't get up. Elena was moving before she thought about it, crossing the yard at a run. The other men had backed off, giving the horse space, and someone had finally gotten a rope on it. Pruitt was conscious but gasping, his face white with pain, his left arm hanging at a wrong angle. "Don't move him," Elena snapped, dropping to her knees beside him. "Someone get me a flatboard and strips of cloth. Now!" Wade appeared with a plank from the barn. Elena tested Pruitt's shoulder carefully, feeling the displacement, the unnatural give. Dislocated, not broken, but it needed to be set before the swelling got worse. "This is going to hurt," she told Pruitt, meeting his eyes. "But if I don't do it now, you'll be useless for weeks." "Do it," he gasped. She braced her boot against his ribs for leverage, gripped his wrist firmly, and pulled while rotating his arm in one smooth, practiced motion. The shoulder popped back into place with an audible sound that made several of the watching men wince. Pruitt shouted once, sharp and hoarse, then sagged back against the mud, breathing hard. Elena tied his arm against his chest with the cloth strips, immobilizing the joint. "Keep this on for a week. No heavy lifting, no riding. Move it too soon and you'll dislocate it again." She looked up and found every man in the yard staring at her, not with dismissal this time, with something closer to surprise. Wade spoke first. "Where'd you learn that?" "My husband was a drunk who picked fights he couldn't win," Elena said flatly, standing and brushing mud off her skirt. "You learned to set bones, or you learned to live with the screaming?" She walked back to the kitchen without waiting for a response, her hands shaking now that the crisis had passed. Through the window, she watched Wade and another man help Pruitt to his feet and toward the bunkhouse. Coulson stood near the barn, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. That night, the men ate her stew and biscuits without complaint. Davis caught her eye across the room and gave a small nod. Not quite an apology, but close enough. And when Coulson left, he paused at the door and said, "Good work today, Mrs. Mercer." It wasn't much, but it was the first time he'd acknowledged her as anything other than a liability, and Elena held on to those words like a lifeline. The week wasn't over yet, but for the first time since arriving at Ironvale Ranch, she thought she might actually survive it. She fell asleep that night to the sound of wind against the windows, and for once, she didn't dream of Philadelphia. The 7th morning arrived cold and clear, the kind of brittle sunlight that made everything look sharper than it was. Elena woke with the now familiar ache in her shoulders and the knowledge that today marked the end of Coulson's trial period. She'd made it through the week without getting sent back to Blackthorn Ridge, but survival and success weren't the same thing. She dressed in the dark and went to start the stove, her hands moving through the routine with more confidence than she'd had 6 days ago. The fire caught on the first try, small victories. The men filed in for breakfast as usual, their faces still creased from sleep, their movements slow in the early cold. But something had shifted in the past 2 days. Davis nodded to her when he poured his coffee. Another hand, a grizzled man named Coleman, who'd never spoken a word to her, grunted "morning" as he passed. Even Pruitt, his arm still bound against his chest, managed a quiet "thank you, ma'am," when she set down the platter of bacon. Coulson arrived last, as always. He filled his plate, ate in silence, and then stood and cleared his throat. "Mrs. Mercer, my office, please, when you're finished here." The kitchen went quiet. Elena kept her expression neutral and nodded. "Of course." The men exchanged glances as Coulson left. Wade caught her eye across the room and gave her a look that might have been sympathy or might have been respect, hard to tell with his weathered face. She finished serving, cleared the dishes, and wiped down the counter with hands that wanted to shake but didn't. Then she removed her apron, smoothed her hair, and walked through the house to the small room off the main hall that Coulson used as an office. He was standing by the window, looking out toward the corrals. He didn't turn when she entered. "Close the door." She did. The room smelled of leather and old paper. A desk took up most of the space, covered in ledgers and correspondence. A rifle stood in the corner. No personal items anywhere. No photographs, no mementos, nothing that suggested a life beyond the relentless machinery of running the ranch. "Your week is up," Coulson said, still not looking at her. "Yes, sir." "The men haven't complained about the food. Wade says you keep the kitchen cleaner than it's been in 4 years, and Pruitt's shoulder is healing properly." He turned then, his storm cloud eyes meeting hers directly. "You've done adequate work, Mrs. Mercer." Adequate. The word hung in the air like a judgment that could tip either direction. "Thank you," Elena said carefully. "I'm offering you the position permanently. $30 a month, room and board included. You'll have Sundays free after the noon meal, and you can order personal supplies on the Monday runs if you need them. Same expectations as this week. Meals on time, kitchen maintained, no waste. Any questions?" Relief hit her so hard she had to lock her knees to keep standing. $30 a month wasn't wealth, but it was more than she'd hoped for, more than she'd had in Philadelphia toward the end. It was survival with a margin for error. "No questions," she said. "I accept." "Good." He pulled open a drawer and withdrew a small leather pouch, counted out $30 in bills and coins, and held it out. "First month, paid in advance. After this, you'll get paid on the first of each month." Elena took the money with hands that stayed steady through sheer force of will. "I appreciate the opportunity, Mr. Coulson." "Don't thank me yet. Winter's just starting, and it gets harder from here." He sat down at the desk and pulled a ledger toward him, already moving on to the next problem. "That's all." She left the office, closed the door quietly behind her, and stood in the hallway for a long moment, staring at the money in her hands. $30. A permanent position. A room of her own and work that she knew how to do. It wasn't everything, but it was enough. She tucked the money into her pocket and went back to the kitchen to start preparing the noon meal. The days settled into a rhythm after that. Wake before dawn, light the stove, make coffee strong enough to strip paint, feed 12 men who worked like machinery, efficient, uncomplaining, always hungry, clean the kitchen until it gleamed, prepare the next meal, serve, clean again. The work was relentless, but it was predictable, and Elena had learned young that predictable was better than chaos. She started to learn the ranch's particular language. The way Wade would appear in the kitchen doorway and say, "We'll be 8 for supper tonight," meant 4 men had ridden out to one of the line camps and wouldn't be back until morning. When Coleman asked if there was extra bread, it meant someone was sick in the bunkhouse and needed something gentle on the stomach. When Davis showed up early and offered to carry water from the pump, it meant he'd done something stupid and was trying to get ahead of trouble. She learned that Coulson took his coffee black and his meals without comment, that Wade had a sweet tooth he tried to hide, that Pruitt was left-handed and struggled cutting meat with his injured shoulder, that the young kid everyone called Birch was barely 18 and homesick for a family he never talked about. The kitchen stopped feeling like enemy territory and started feeling like hers. 3 weeks after she'd arrived, Elena was kneading bread dough when Wade appeared in the doorway, hat in hand. "Got a minute, Mrs. Mercer?" She looked up, flour dusting her forearms. "Of course." He stepped inside and closed the door, unusual enough that Elena felt a flutter of worry. Wade wasn't a man who dealt in privacy unless something was wrong. "Wanted to talk to you about supplies," he said. "You've been ordering the basics, but I'm wondering if there's anything else you need. Spices, maybe? Dried fruit? Things that would make the meals more interesting." Elena wiped her hands on her apron, considering. "Are you asking because the men are complaining, or because you think there's room in the budget?" Wade's mouth twitched. "Little of both. The food's good, don't misunderstand, but it's the same rotation week after week. Men get tired of that, makes them cranky, and cranky men make mistakes. What's the budget? For food? Whatever you need within reason. Coulson doesn't skimp on feeding the crew, knows it's cheaper than replacing men who quit because they're miserable." Elena thought about the meals she'd been making. Simple, filling, competent, but uninspired. She'd been cooking to survive, not to impress. But if she had room to work, if she could access better ingredients, she could do more than just feed these men. She could give them something to look forward to. "I'll make a list," she said, "but I want to be clear. I'm not promising luxury, just variety." "Variety's enough." Wade settled his hat back on his head. "Oh, and one more thing. Coulson's birthday is next month, February 14th. The men usually do something for it. Nothing fancy, just a recognition. If you wanted to make something special, a cake maybe, it would be appreciated." Elena filed that information away. "I'll see what I can do." Wade nodded and left. Through the window, she watched him cross the yard toward the barn, his gait stiff from decades in the saddle. The man was probably 60 if he was a day, and he moved like someone who'd earned every ache. She went back to her bread dough, but her mind was already working through possibilities. Cinnamon and nutmeg for the oatmeal. Dried apples for pies. Real vanilla if the budget would stretch. Coffee cake for Sunday mornings. Molasses cookies that would keep in the bunkhouse for the night shifts. Food was more than fuel, it was comfort, memory, the small kindnesses that made hard work bearable. She'd learned that in Philadelphia, making meals stretch when Thomas's gambling had emptied the accounts, finding ways to make her sister feel cared for when their parents died. You couldn't fix everything with food, but you could make people feel less alone while they faced whatever was breaking them. That night, she made a venison stew with herbs she'd found dried and forgotten in the back of the pantry, sage and thyme that transformed the meat from simple to savory. She baked cornbread with a hint of honey and butter brushed on top while it was still hot. Davis took one bite and stopped mid-chew. "This is different." "Is that a complaint?" Elena asked. "No, ma'am. It's real good." Around the table, the other men murmured agreement. Even Coulson, who never commented on the food, took a second serving. Small victories. Elena was learning to savor them. The following Monday, she rode into Blackthorn Ridge with Wade on the supply run. The town looked less hostile in daylight, though still bleak. A collection of buildings huddled against the wind, populated by hard people making hard livings. Wade introduced her around the general store, and the owner, a thin man named Silas Grant, treated her with more respect than he had on her first visit. "Heard you're working out at Iron Vale," Grant said, as he measured out the cinnamon she'd requested. "That's good. Coulson's had trouble keeping help." "Why is that?" Elena asked. Grant glanced at Wade, who was examining harness leather on the other side of the store. He lowered his voice. "Place has a reputation. After his wife died, Coulson let the ranch go dark. Not the work. That kept on just fine. But the living part. No warmth, no kindness, just endless labor. Most folks can't take that for long." "What was his wife like?" "Margaret? Sweet woman, gentle. Completely wrong for frontier life, if you ask me. But Coulson loved her fierce. When she died in childbirth and the baby followed 2 days later, something in him just shut down. Been 4 years and he's never opened back up." Elena thought about the cold, empty house, the lack of curtains or photographs, the way Coulson moved through his own home like a ghost passing through rooms that no longer held meaning. "That's a hard grief," she said quietly, "hard enough to kill a weaker man." Grant wrapped the cinnamon in brown paper and tied it with string. "You need anything else?" She bought vanilla, dried cherries, and a small tin of cocoa powder, luxuries that made her wince at the cost, but would transform ordinary meals into something memorable. Wade raised an eyebrow when he saw the cocoa but didn't comment, just loaded it into the wagon with the flour and coffee. On the ride back, Elena watched the empty prairie roll past and thought about Margaret Coulson, about a gentle woman trying to survive in a place that demanded hardness. She thought about the baby who'd lived 2 days, long enough to be loved and then lost. About Rhett Coulson, who'd buried them both and then buried himself in work deep enough to drown in. "He's a fair man," Wade said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Cold but fair. Pays decent, doesn't cheat, takes care of his crew, but he's been alone a long time, probably forgotten how to be anything else." Elena didn't answer. She was still learning the rules of this place, still figuring out where the boundaries were and what happened if you crossed them. That night, she made chocolate cake using the cocoa and the last of the preserved cherries. She served it without comment, just set the slices down and waited. The men ate in stunned silence. Birch looked like he might cry. Coleman made a sound that might have been approval or might have been indigestion. Davis ate his piece so fast he nearly choked, then looked at the empty pan with naked longing. Coulson took a bite, chewed slowly, and then set down his fork. He didn't say anything, but something in his expression shifted. Just for a moment, the coldness cracked, and Elena saw the man underneath. Tired. Lonely. Trying very hard not to feel anything at all. Then the moment passed, and he was stone again. But when he left that night, he paused at the door. "That was good, Mrs. Mercer. Thank you." 3 words. They shouldn't have mattered as much as they did. January bled into February, the cold deepening until it felt like the earth itself had frozen solid. The men worked shorter days now, the livestock requiring constant attention to keep them alive through the brutal temperatures. Elena kept the kitchen fires burning and the coffee hot, preparing meals that would stick to ribs and keep men warm through long hours outside. She fell into conversations with Wade during the quiet moments. The foreman had a dry sense of humor and a sharp mind hidden behind his weathered exterior. He told her stories about the ranch, about cattle drives and wild horses and winters so harsh that men went mad from isolation. He told her about Margaret, about how she'd tried to make the ranch into a home with curtains and flower boxes and Sunday suppers that felt like family. Coulson took it all down after she died, Wade said one afternoon while Elena was rolling out pie dough. Packed up her things, removed every trace, said it hurt too much to look at. "That's one way to handle grief," Elena said carefully. "It's a coward's way." Wade's voice was blunt. Margaret would have hated it. She wanted this place to be more than a work camp, wanted it to be worth living for, not just surviving in. Elena thought about the empty house, the lack of anything personal or warm. What happened to her things? Stored in the attic, far as I know. Coulson won't touch them, won't let anyone else touch them either. She filed that information away and went back to her pie. But later, when the kitchen was clean and the men were settled in the bunkhouse, she found herself standing in the hallway, looking up at the narrow stairs that led to the second floor. She'd never been up there, had no reason to go. But curiosity was a powerful thing, and Elena had always been the kind of woman who needed to understand the full shape of a problem before she could solve it. The stairs creaked under her weight. At the top, a short hallway led to 3 closed doors. She opened the first and found what must have been Coulson's bedroom. Austere, impersonal, just a bed and a trunk, and nothing else. The second door opened to an empty room, dust thick on the floor. The third door was locked. Elena stood there for a long moment, her hand on the knob, weighing curiosity against privacy. Then she heard boots on the porch below and retreated quickly, slipping back down the stairs and into the kitchen before Coulson could catch her snooping. But the locked door stayed in her mind. The week before Coulson's birthday, a storm rolled in. Not snow, but ice, the kind that coated everything in a crystalline shell and made walking treacherous. The men moved carefully through their chores, and twice Elena heard the sickening sound of someone slipping and cursing in the yard. She was preparing supper when the kitchen door banged open and Davis stumbled in, supporting Birch, who was white-faced and shaking. "He went through the ice on the water trough," Davis said. "Soaked through." Elena was already moving. "Get him by the stove. Strip off the wet clothes. Wade, I need blankets from the bunkhouse and boil water for tea, strong and sweet." She'd seen hypothermia before, back when Thomas would come home in winter too drunk to find the door, and she'd have to warm him up before he froze. Birch was young and strong, which helped, but his lips were blue and his hands were clumsy as Davis helped him out of his soaked shirt and pants. Elena wrapped him in a dry quilt and positioned him close to the stove, close enough to warm, not close enough to burn. She made tea with honey and a splash of whiskey from the medicinal bottle Wade kept for emergencies, and stood over Birch while he drank it in shaking sips. "You'll be fine," she said firmly. "But you're sleeping in here tonight where I can keep the fire going. No arguments." Birch nodded, too cold and miserable to protest. By the time Coulson arrived for supper, Birch was warm and drowsy, curled by the stove like a kid despite being technically a man grown. Coulson took in the scene without comment, then looked at Elena. "He all right?" "He will be. Needs rest and warmth, that's all." Coulson nodded. "Good call keeping him here." He looked at Birch, and something almost gentle crossed his face. "You're lucky, kid. Could have been worse." "Yes, sir," Birch mumbled. That night, after the men had eaten and left, Elena sat in the kitchen with Birch sleeping near the stove and thought about the strange community she'd stumbled into. These weren't soft men. They worked brutal hours in brutal conditions, lived rough, and expected nothing from the world but what they could carve out with their own hands. But they looked after each other. When someone fell, someone else picked them up. It was more than she'd had in Philadelphia. The morning of Coulson's birthday dawned clear and bitter cold. Elena woke early, earlier than usual, and started on the cake. 3 layers, chocolate with a hint of coffee to deepen the flavor, filled with cherry preserves, and frosted with a buttercream she'd practiced twice to get right. It was extravagant and probably foolish, but Wade had said the men appreciated it, and Elena had learned that small gestures mattered in a place where everything was hard. She served breakfast as usual, made it through the noon meal, and then spent the afternoon finishing the cake. By the time supper rolled around, she had it ready, not beautiful, but solid and real, the kind of thing that said someone had taken time and care. The men filed in for supper, and Wade cleared his throat. "Before we eat, we've got a birthday to acknowledge. Coulson, you've kept this ranch running another year, kept us all employed and fed, and we appreciate it. Mrs. Mercer made something special." Elena carried the cake out from the kitchen and set it on the table in front of Coulson. The room went quiet. Coulson stared at the cake like it was something dangerous, his expression unreadable. "Happy birthday, Mr. Coulson," Elena said quietly. He looked up at her, and for the second time she saw past the walls he kept around himself. He looked lost, like a man who'd forgotten what kindness felt like and didn't know how to accept it now that it was being offered. "Thank you, Mrs. Mercer," he said, his voice rougher than usual. This is He stopped, swallowed. This is very kind. The men ate cake and laughed and told stories about past birthdays on the ranch. Someone produced a bottle of decent whiskey, and glasses were passed around. Elena watched from the doorway, separate but not unwelcome, and felt something shift in her chest. This was what Margaret Colson had wanted, she thought. Not perfection. Just moments like this. Community. Warmth. The sense that life was more than survival. Later, after the men had gone and the kitchen was clean, Colson appeared in the doorway. I wanted to thank you again, he said, for the cake and for, he gestured vaguely, for making this feel less empty. Elena turned from the sink, drying her hands on a towel. You're welcome. He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him struggling with something. Finally, he said, my wife used to do things like this. Make the ranch feel like more than just work. I thought after she died that it was easier to just let it be what it was, a place to work and nothing more. But tonight reminded me that wasn't what she would have wanted. What would she have wanted? For this to be a home. He looked around the kitchen, seeing something Elena couldn't. She died trying to give me a family. Seems wrong to let the place she loved turn into a tomb. Elena didn't know what to say to that. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but heavy with things unsaid. Finally, Colson nodded. Good night, Mrs. Mercer. Good night. He left, and Elena stood alone in the quiet kitchen, thinking about locked doors and packed away curtains, and the weight of grief that some people carried until it became part of their bones. She was still thinking about it when she finally went to bed, the wind howling outside and the house creaking around her like something alive. The change started small. The morning after his birthday, Colson appeared in the kitchen while Elena was measuring coffee grounds and asked if she needed anything from town on the next supply run. It was a simple question, the kind Wade usually handled, but coming from Colson, it felt significant, like a door opening just wide enough to see light through. I'm managing fine, Elena said, but thank you for asking. He nodded and left, but the next day he was back, this time carrying a crate of preserves up from the root cellar without being asked. The day after that, he fixed the loose hinge on the pantry door that had been catching for weeks. Wade noticed. Boss is actually talking to people again, he said one afternoon while Elena was chopping vegetables. Haven't seen that in years. Maybe he's just being practical, Elena said, keeping her eyes on her work. Practical. Wade snorted. That what we're calling it now? Elena didn't answer, but she'd noticed too. The way Colson lingered in the kitchen sometimes, ostensibly checking on something, but really just standing there, present in a way he hadn't been before. The way he'd started saying good morning instead of just grunting. Small things that added up to something she didn't want to name yet. February dragged on, the cold, relentless, and mean. The men worked in shifts now, shorter hours to prevent frostbite, and the bunkhouse stove burned constantly. Elena kept the kitchen warm and the meals heavy, knowing they needed every calorie to fight the weather. One Sunday afternoon, her half-day off, she was reading a worn copy of Dickens she'd found on a shelf when Colson knocked on her door. Mrs. Mercer, could I have a word? She set the book aside and opened the door. He stood in the hallway, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable in a way she'd never seen him. Is something wrong? She asked. No, I wanted to... He stopped, started again. I've been thinking about what you said, about the house feeling empty, and I thought maybe you might want to make some changes. To the kitchen, I mean, or other rooms. If there are things that would make the work easier, or just make the place more livable. Elena studied him carefully. What kind of changes? Whatever you think is needed, curtains maybe, or different furniture. Margaret had things stored upstairs that you might find useful. He met her eyes. I know I've kept this place like a graveyard. That's not fair to anyone living here now. It was the most personal thing he'd ever said to her, and Elena felt the weight of it. This wasn't about practicality. This was about a man trying to come back from a place so dark he'd nearly disappeared into it. I'd be honored to help, she said quietly, if you're sure. I'm sure. He handed her a key, small and brass, worn smooth from use. The third door upstairs. Margaret's things are in there. Take what you want, leave what you don't. And Mrs. Mercer? He paused at the doorway. Thank you for everything you've done here. Then he was gone, leaving Elena standing with the key warm in her palm and her heart beating faster than it should. She waited until after supper, when the men were settled in the bunkhouse and the kitchen was spotless. Then she climbed the stairs, the key clutched tight, and stood in front of the locked door for the second time. This time it opened. The room beyond was full of ghosts, crates and trunks stacked against the walls, furniture covered in sheets, everything layered with dust that glowed in the lamplight. Elena stepped inside carefully, feeling like an intruder in someone else's grief. She lifted the first sheet and found a rocking chair, beautifully made with carved arms and a curved back. Beneath another sheet, a small table with delicate legs. A trunk yielded curtains, cream-colored linen with embroidered edges, the kind of thing that took hours of patient work. Another held quilts, tablecloths, a set of china painted with tiny blue flowers. Margaret Colson had tried to make a home here, Elena thought, had brought beauty to a brutal place and fought to keep it alive. These weren't just possessions, they were acts of defiance against the emptiness. Elena found herself sitting on the floor surrounded by another woman's dreams and crying for the first time since Thomas died. Not for him. She'd shed those tears already and found them wanting. She cried for Margaret, who'd died trying to give life, for Colson, who'd buried his heart with his wife and child, for herself, for all the years she'd spent making do and pretending that was enough. When the tears finally stopped, she wiped her face on her sleeve, stood up, and got to work. Over the next 3 days, during the margins of her regular work, Elena transformed the house. She hung curtains in the kitchen, letting in light that had been blocked by bare windows for years. She brought down the rocking chair and placed it near the stove where it caught the warmth. The quilts went on the beds in the bunkhouse, practical and beautiful at once. The china stayed carefully wrapped, too precious for everyday use, but there if needed. She found a painting wrapped in burlap, a prairie landscape with storm clouds gathering on the horizon. It was simple but striking, and she hung it in the main room where Colson would see it every day. A reminder that beauty could exist even in hard country. The men noticed immediately. Davis stood in the kitchen doorway, staring at the curtains like they might attack him. "Place looks different," he said finally. "Does it bother you?" Elena asked. "No, ma'am. Just strange seeing it look like a real house instead of a barracks." Colson said nothing when he came in for supper that night, but Elena saw him pause in the main room, saw him look at the painting for a long moment before he moved on. Later, she found him standing in the kitchen, running his hand along the back of the rocking chair. "She sat here every evening," he said quietly, "sewed baby clothes and hummed songs I didn't know the names of." Elena stayed where she was, giving him space. "I can put it back if it's too difficult." "No." His voice was firm. "It belongs here. She'd be angry if she knew I'd locked it all away." He looked at Elena then, really looked at her. "You're making this place live again." "I'm just using what was already here." "It's more than that." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Would you walk with me? There's something I want to show you." They went out into the brutal cold, Elena wrapping herself in her heaviest shawl, following Colson across the frozen yard. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed impossible against all that white and gray. He led her to a rise behind the barn where 2 wooden markers stood in the frozen ground. "Margaret and Sarah," he said, "my wife and daughter." Elena stood beside him in the failing light and said nothing. Sometimes silence was the only appropriate response. "Sarah lived 2 days," Colson continued, "long enough that I thought we might keep her, long enough to break my heart when we didn't." He looked at the markers. "Margaret died trying to bring her into the world, and I've spent 4 years being angry about it. Angry at her for leaving, angry at myself for not being able to save them, angry at everything that kept turning without them in it." "Anger's easier than grief," Elena said quietly. "Yes." He turned to her. "But it's a cold thing to live with, and I'm tired of being cold." The wind picked up, cutting through their clothes, and Elena shivered despite herself. Colson noticed and gestured back toward the house. "We should get inside before we freeze." They walked back in silence, but something had changed between them. A line had been crossed, a confidence shared that couldn't be taken back. That night, lying in her narrow bed, Elena thought about Rhett Colson standing beside his wife's grave and admitting he was tired of being alone. Thought about the way he'd looked at her in the kitchen, like he was seeing something he'd forgotten could exist. She knew what was happening, had known for weeks if she was honest with herself, but knowing and accepting were different things. and Elena had learned to be careful with her heart. The weather broke in early March, the temperature climbing just enough to feel like mercy instead of punishment. The men worked longer hours, taking advantage of the reprieve, and the mood on the ranch shifted from grim endurance to something almost cheerful. Elena made apple cobbler for Sunday supper, using the last of the dried fruit. The men ate it like starving animals, and afterward Coleman actually smiled at her, a rare sight that made Wade laugh out loud. "You've spoiled them," Wade told her later while she was washing dishes. "They'll never survive on regular cooking again." "Then they'd better make sure I stay," Elena said lightly. "Oh, I don't think you need to worry about that." Wade's tone was knowing. "Boss would chain you to the stove if he thought you were leaving." Elena felt heat creep up her neck. "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" Wade dried a plate with maddening slowness. "Man's been alone 4 years. Now there's a competent, handsome woman running his household, making his house feel like a home, and treating him like a human being instead of a ghost. You really think he hasn't noticed?" "Wade, I'm just saying, Mrs. Mercer, you might want to think about what you want out of this arrangement. Because Colson's thinking about it, whether he said anything yet or not." He left her with that, and Elena stood at the sink with soapy hands and a racing heart, wondering when her simple plan to survive had gotten so complicated. The storm warning started 3 days later. The sky turned a peculiar yellow-gray, and the wind shifted to come from the north with a bite that promised violence. Wade gathered the men at breakfast and laid out the situation with his usual bluntness. "Major storm coming. Could hit tonight, could hit tomorrow, but it's coming, and it'll be bad. We need to get the livestock closer in, secure everything that can blow away, and stock up the line camps in case anyone gets caught out there." Colson was already on his feet. "Davis, Coleman, take the north pasture. Pruitt and Birch, you've got the south. Wade and I will handle the west range. Everyone else, secure the buildings and bring in extra firewood. We move fast and we move smart." The men scattered. Elena caught Wade's arm as he passed. "What do I need to do?" "Keep the kitchen fires going and food ready. Men are going to be working straight through, and they'll need to eat fast and get back out there. If the storm hits while they're still out, we'll need hot food and dry clothes ready when they come back." "Understood." She spent the day in constant motion. Bread baking in rotation so there'd always be something fresh. Stew simmering on the stove, thick with meat and vegetables that would stick to ribs. Coffee by the gallon. She brought in wood until her arms ached, stacking it near the stove so she wouldn't have to go outside once the storm hit. The men came and went in waves, gulping down food and coffee, stripping off wet outer layers, warming themselves briefly before heading back out. Elena kept everything moving, refilling plates and cups, drying coats by the stove, making sure no one went back into the cold without being as ready as possible. The sky darkened early. By 4 in the afternoon it looked like midnight, and the wind was screaming around the corners of the house. Elena lit every lamp in the kitchen and kept working. Colson came in around 5, his face raw from cold and wind. "Most of the men are back. Wade and Davis are making a last check on the North Line camp. Should be back within the hour." "Sit down and eat something," Elena ordered. "You look half frozen." "I'm fine." "You're not. Sit." He was too tired to argue. He sat at the kitchen table, and Elena put a bowl of stew and half a loaf of bread in front of him, then poured coffee so hot it steamed. She watched him eat, saw how his hands shook slightly, saw the exhaustion in the set of his shoulders. "When did you last sleep?" she asked. "Yesterday." He broke off more bread. "I'll sleep when the storm passes." "That's foolish." "Maybe." He looked up at her. "But it's my ranch and my responsibility. I don't ask my men to do anything I won't do myself." The first real blast of the storm hit just after 6. The wind turned from strong to violent, rattling the windows and finding every crack in the walls. Snow came with it, not falling but driving horizontal, turning the world white and formless. Wade and Davis stumbled in 20 minutes later, both of them covered in snow and ice, barely able to stand. Elena got them by the stove immediately, stripping off their frozen outer layers, wrapping them in blankets, forcing hot coffee into their shaking hands. "All accounted for?" Colson asked. "Everyone's in," Wade managed through chattering teeth. "Line camps are stocked. Livestock is as secure as we can make them. Now we wait it out." The storm settled in for the night. Elena kept the fires burning and the coffee fresh while the wind tried to tear the house apart. The men gathered in the bunkhouse, but Coulson stayed in the main house, pacing between the windows like he could protect the ranch through sheer will. Around midnight, Elena found him standing at the front window, staring out into nothing. "You can't see anything out there," she said. "I know." But he didn't move. She brought him coffee, and they stood together in silence, listening to the storm rage. After a long while, he said, "I hate this. The waiting. The not knowing if something's going wrong until it's too late to fix it. Some things you can't control, no matter how hard you try. That doesn't make it easier." "No," Elena agreed. "It doesn't." He turned to look at her. "How are you so calm?" "I'm not. I'm terrified. But panic doesn't help anyone, so I do what I can and hope it's enough. And if it's not, then I deal with whatever comes next." She met his eyes. "That's all anyone can do, Rhett." It was the first time she'd used his given name, and something shifted in his expression. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand. His palm was warm and calloused, solid and real. "I'm glad you're here," he said quietly. "In this house, on this ranch. I'm glad it's you." Elena's heart was pounding so hard she thought he must be able to hear it. "I'm glad too." They stood like that for a moment, hands clasped, while the storm tried to erase the world outside. Then Rhett stepped back, released her hand, and said, "You should get some sleep. Tomorrow will be hard work digging out." "So should you. Soon." He turned back to the window. "I'll just stay a while longer." Elena left him there and went to her room, but she didn't sleep. She lay in the dark listening to the wind and thinking about the warmth of his hand, about the way he'd looked at her, about the vast distance between surviving and living, and how easy it would be to fall across that line. The storm raged for 2 days. Elena kept the kitchen running, feeding men who came in half frozen and went back out to fight through the snow, checking on livestock, breaking ice off water troughs, digging paths between buildings. She made stew and bread and coffee and more stew, losing track of time, moving through exhaustion into a strange clarity where nothing existed except the next task. On the second night, Birch didn't come back with the others. Davis burst into the kitchen wild-eyed. "Birch went to check the south barn and hasn't come back. It's been 2 hours." Coulson was already grabbing his coat. "Wade Coleman, with me. Davis, get fresh horses ready." "I'm going too," Elena said. "Absolutely not. He could be hurt. You'll need someone who knows how to treat injuries in the field." "Elena, don't argue with me. Get the horses ready." They stared at each other for a charged moment, then Rhett nodded sharply. "Get your warmest clothes, and stay close to me out there." They rode out into hell. The storm had eased slightly, but visibility was still maybe 20 feet, and the cold was sharp enough to steal breath. Elena had never experienced anything like it, the wind trying to pull her off the horse, the snow stinging her face like needles, the complete disorientation of not being able to see landmarks. Rhett kept his horse close to hers, one hand occasionally reaching out to make sure she was still there. They made it to the south barn and found the door standing open, snow drifted inside. "Birch!" Rhett's voice was nearly lost in the wind. "Birch!" A weak sound from deeper in the barn. They dismounted and followed it to a corner where Birch lay crumpled against a stall, his leg twisted at a bad angle, his face white with pain and cold. "Horse spooked and kicked me," he gasped. "Couldn't make it back." Elena knelt beside him, her hands already assessing the damage despite the cold making her fingers clumsy. The leg was broken, badly, and he'd been lying here losing heat for hours. If they didn't get him warm soon, the broken leg would be the least of his problems. "We need to stabilize this before we move him," she said. "Wade, find me something straight and sturdy. Coleman, get blankets from the tack room." She worked fast, her training from years of dealing with Thomas's drunken accidents coming back sharp and clear. Straighten the leg, ignore Birch's scream of pain, bind it tight to the board, wrap him in every blanket they could find. Then Rhett lifted him like he weighed nothing and carried him out to the horses. The ride back was worse than the ride out. Birch drifted in and out of consciousness, and Elena rode alongside him, one hand on his shoulder, keeping him as stable as possible while the wind tried to kill them all. When they finally made it back to the house, Elena took over completely. She converted the kitchen into a field hospital, boiling water, cutting away Birch's frozen pant leg, setting the bone properly while Wade and Davis held him down and Rhett stood in the corner looking like he might be sick. This is going to hurt, she told Birch. But you're young and strong and you'll heal. Trust me. She pulled the bone back into alignment with a sickening crunch, and Birch screamed once and then passed out. Elena worked quickly, splinting the leg properly, checking for circulation, wrapping everything secure. He needs to stay warm and still for at least 6 weeks, she said, washing blood off her hands. Someone will need to check on him every few hours to make sure he doesn't develop fever. I'll do it, Rhett said immediately. You've done enough. We'll take shifts. Elena was already exhausted, swaying on her feet. He's going to need careful watching. Rhett crossed the room and took her shoulders gently. Elena, you need to rest. You've been going for 2 straight days. I'm fine. You're not. Please. Let me take the first watch. You sleep for a few hours, and then you can spell me. She wanted to argue, but the room was starting to tilt, and her hands wouldn't stop shaking. All right, a few hours. He helped her to her room, and she was asleep before her head hit the pillow. She woke 6 hours later to find Rhett still sitting beside Birch's makeshift bed in the kitchen, his head nodded forward in exhausted sleep. The storm outside had finally broken, and weak sunlight was trying to push through the windows. Elena stood and watched him for a moment. This hard man who'd lost everything and built walls so high nothing could get through, now sitting vigil over a kid who'd gotten hurt on his watch. She thought about the way he'd looked at her in the storm, about his hand in hers, about all the ways grief could break a person or remake them into something stronger. Then she went to wake him gently, to tell him Birch was stable and the storm was over and they'd all survived another impossible night. And when Rhett looked up at her with exhaustion and relief and something deeper in his eyes, Elena finally admitted to herself that she wasn't just surviving at Ironvale Ranch anymore. She was building a life. Rhett blinked awake slowly, disoriented, his neck stiff from sleeping upright in a chair. For a moment he didn't remember where he was, and then he saw Birch sleeping peacefully by the stove and Elena standing in the doorway with sunlight behind her. You should have woken me sooner, he said, his voice rough. You needed the rest. She moved into the kitchen, already pulling on her apron. Besides, Birch has been quiet all night. Fever hasn't spiked. Rhett stood and stretched, feeling every one of his 44 years in his back and shoulders. Through the window, the world was blindingly white, the storm's violence replaced by an eerie calm. I need to check the damage, see what we lost. Eat something first. Elena, eat. She was already cracking eggs into a pan. You're no good to anyone if you collapse. Sit down. He sat, too tired to argue, and watched her work. She moved through the kitchen with an efficiency that came from months of practice, every motion economical and sure. Her hair had come loose from its pins during the night, falling around her shoulders in a way that made her look younger, less guarded. She set a plate in front of him, eggs, bacon, bread toasted in the bacon fat. Simple food that tasted like it had been prepared by someone who cared whether he lived or died. Thank you, he said, for last night, for Birch, for all of it. Elena poured herself coffee and sat across from him, wrapping her hands around the cup for warmth. You would have done the same. Maybe, but I wouldn't have known how to set that leg properly. Kid would have lost it without you. I did what needed doing, same as you. They sat in comfortable silence while he ate, and the kitchen slowly filled with the sounds of morning, the stove crackling, Birch's steady breathing, the house settling around them. Outside, Elena could hear the men beginning to move around, assessing storm damage, starting the brutal work of digging out. We lost part of the north barn roof, Wade announced when he came in an hour later, stamping snow off his boots. And we've got 3 cattle dead in the east pasture. Could have been worse. Could have been better, Rhett said, but there was no heat in it. He looked exhausted and relieved in equal measure. The week that followed was brutal. The men worked from dawn until long after dark, repairing damage, digging out paths, checking on scattered livestock. Elena kept the kitchen running at full capacity, producing meals that could fuel men doing the work of mules. Birch remained camped by the stove, his leg elevated, bored out of his mind, but healing cleanly. Elena changed his bandages daily, checked for infection, and listened to him complain about being useless. You're healing, she told him on the 4th day. That's not useless, that's necessary. Give it time. Time's all I've got, Birch muttered. Feel like dead weight. Then make yourself useful in other ways. You can peel potatoes sitting down, can't you? His face brightened. Yes, ma'am. So Birch became her assistant, peeling vegetables and shelling beans and keeping her company while she worked. He talked about his family back in Missouri, about the farm they'd lost to bad crops and worse luck, about coming west with nothing but hope and finding work at Iron Vale. "Mr. Colson's hard," Birch said one afternoon. "But he's fair, pays what he promises, doesn't cheat. Some of the other ranches around here, they'll work you to death and throw you away when you break. Not here." Elena thought about Rhett sitting vigil over Birch's bedside, about the way he drove himself harder than any of his men. He cares about his crew, even if he doesn't always show it. "He cares about you too, ma'am. Anyone can see that." Elena's hand stilled on the bread dough she was kneading. "That's inappropriate talk, Birch." "Sorry, ma'am. Just meant he smiles more now. Didn't even know he could smile before you came." She didn't know what to say to that, so she went back to her bread and pretended she hadn't heard. But Birch's words stayed with her, circling in her mind like birds looking for a place to land. 2 weeks after the storm, on a Sunday afternoon when Elena had finished the noon meal and the men had scattered to their various pursuits, Rhett knocked on the kitchen door. "Got a minute?" he asked. Of course. He came in and stood awkwardly by the table, turning his hat in his hands. Elena had never seen him look uncertain before, and it made her nervous. "I wanted to talk to you about something," he said. "About the ranch. About the future." Elena's heart started beating faster. "All right. We're heading into spring soon. Calving season, then branding, then the summer work. It's the busiest time of year and I'll need to hire on extra hands, which means more mouths to feed, more work for you. I can handle it." "I know you can. That's not what I'm worried about." He set his hat on the table and looked at her directly. "I'm worried that you'll decide this life isn't what you want, that you'll go back east or find something easier, and I need to know if that's a possibility I should be preparing for." Elena crossed her arms, suddenly defensive. "Have I given you any reason to think I'm leaving?" "No. But I also know you didn't come here planning to stay forever. You came because you had nowhere else to go." It stung because it was true. She had come to Iron Vale Ranch out of desperation, not choice, but that was months ago, and everything had changed since then. "You're right," she said quietly. "I came here because I was out of options, but I'm still here because I choose to be. This place," she gestured around the kitchen, "this work, these people, it matters to me now. It's not just survival anymore." Something in Rhett's face relaxed. "I'm glad to hear that. Because this place is better with you in it. I'm better with you in it." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning neither of them was quite ready to name. "Rhett," Elena started, then stopped, not sure what she wanted to say. He stepped closer. "I know this isn't what you planned. I know I'm not what anyone would choose if they had better options. I'm too old, too worn down, too full of grief that I'm still trying to figure out how to live with. But Elena, The door burst open and Davis tumbled in, breathless. "Boss, we've got a problem. Riders coming from the east. Look like trouble." Rhett's expression shuddered immediately, everything personal locked away behind the mask of the ranch owner. "How many?" "6. Armed. Get Wade and Coleman. I want everyone who can shoot positioned around the barn." He grabbed his hat and was already moving toward the door. "Elena, stay inside. Lock the doors." "Who are they?" "Don't know yet, but nobody comes to a remote ranch with 6 armed men unless they're looking for something they're not entitled to." He was gone before she could respond. Elena moved to the window and watched as the men gathered in the yard, rifles in hand, faces grim. Birch struggled to sit up, reaching for the crutch Wade had made him. "Stay down," Elena ordered. "You can't fight with that leg." "I can shoot from a window if I have to." "Let's hope it doesn't come to that." The riders appeared a few minutes later, picking their way through the snow-covered path toward the ranch buildings. Even from a distance, Elena could see they were rough men, the kind who wore violence like a second skin. The leader was a big man with a thick beard and a rifle across his saddle. Rhett walked out to meet them, Wade and Coleman flanking him, the rest of the men positioned but not obviously threatening. Elena couldn't hear what was being said, but she could read body language well enough to know it wasn't friendly. The conversation went on for several tense minutes. Then the bearded man pointed toward the house, said something that made Rhett's posture go rigid, and laughed. Rhett said something short and sharp. The bearded man's smile disappeared. He leaned forward in his saddle, one hand dropping toward his gun, and the entire yard went still. Elena held her breath, every muscle locked. This was going to turn into violence, She could feel it building like pressure before a storm. Then Wade said something, low and calm, and gestured toward the barn where more men had appeared, all armed. The bearded man looked around, recalculating odds, and apparently didn't like the new math. He straightened in his saddle, said something that was probably a threat, and wheeled his horse around. The other riders followed, and within moments they were riding back the way they'd come. Elena sagged against the wall, breathing hard. Beside her, Birch lowered the pistol he'd somehow acquired and said, "That was too close." Rhett came back inside a few minutes later, his face dark with anger. "They were Sutter's men. He's trying to buy up land around here, and he doesn't take no for an answer gracefully." "What did they want?" Elena asked. "To make an offer on the ranch. When I refused, they suggested I might reconsider after I'd had time to think about how dangerous this country can be for a man without enough hands to protect his property." His jaw was tight enough to crack teeth. It was a threat dressed up in courtesy. "Will they come back?" "Probably, but not soon, and not without more men. They saw we're ready for trouble." He looked at her, and some of the anger drained from his face. "You all right?" "I'm fine. Scared, but fine." "Good." He ran a hand through his hair. "I need to ride into town tomorrow. Talk to the marshal, let him know Sutter's making threats. And I want to increase our watch rotation until this settles." "I'll come with you," Elena said. "That's not necessary. I need supplies anyway, and I'd rather not be here if those men decide to come back while you're gone." He looked like he wanted to argue, but finally nodded. "We leave at dawn." That night, Elena lay awake listening to the house creak and the wind whisper around the corners. She thought about the riders, about the casual way they'd threatened everything Rhett had built, about how quickly safety could disappear out here, how thin the line was between civilization and chaos. She thought about what Rhett had been trying to say before Davis interrupted, about the future, about choices, about what it meant to stay somewhere not out of necessity, but out of want. Sleep didn't come easy. They left for Blackthorn Ridge as the sun was rising, the air cold and sharp enough to hurt. The road was better than it had been when Elena first arrived, packed snow instead of mud, and the landscape less hostile in the clear morning light. She rode Nell, who'd become a familiar companion over the months of supply runs, and Rhett rode his big bay gelding, both of them quiet in the way of people who'd learned that some things didn't need words. The town appeared on the horizon like a promise of civilization, smoke rising from chimneys, the sound of hammering carrying across the frozen distance. It had grown since Elena's first visit, new buildings going up, more people on the streets. The frontier was filling in, which meant land was getting valuable, which meant men like Sutter would start fighting over it. They stopped at the marshal's office first. The marshal was a lean man in his 50s with sharp eyes and a skeptical expression that suggested he'd heard every lie ever told. "Sutter's been making noise for months," he said when Rhett explained the situation, "buying up properties, making offers that sound generous until you realize he's counting on you being too scared to refuse. But he hasn't broken any laws I can prove." "So we're on our own," Rhett said flatly. "I didn't say that. I said I can't arrest him for being an ambitious bastard. But if his men make another visit and things turn ugly, you send someone to town and I'll ride out. In the meantime, keep your crew armed and your eyes open." It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. They left the marshal's office and headed to the general store, where Silas Grant greeted Elena like an old friend. "Mrs. Mercer, haven't seen you in a month. Heard about the storm. Everyone make it through all right?" "We had one broken leg and some building damage, but everyone's alive." "That's better than some." Grant pulled out his ledger. "What can I get you today?" Elena handed over her carefully written list, and while Grant gathered the supplies, she wandered the store, looking at fabric and buttons and small luxuries she couldn't quite justify purchasing. Her hand lingered on a bolt of dark blue cloth that would make a decent dress, something other than the worn-out things she'd brought from Philadelphia. "You should get it," Rhett said from behind her. Elena jumped. "I don't need it." "Maybe not, but you want it, and you've earned something nice. It's frivolous." "Elena," he met her eyes, "buy the dress fabric. That's an order from your employer." She almost laughed. "You can't order me to spend money on myself. Watch me." He called over to Grant. "Add 3 yards of the blue fabric to Mrs. Mercer's order, and thread to match." Elena wanted to protest, but the truth was she did want it. Wanted something that was hers, chosen because it pleased her, and not because it was practical or necessary. She'd spent so long making do that she'd forgotten what it felt like to have something just because it was beautiful. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You're welcome." They finished the shopping and loaded everything into the wagon. Rhett hesitated before climbing up to the driver's seat, looking at the buildings around them like he was searching for something. "There's a restaurant," he said finally. "Nothing fancy, but the food's decent. Would you like to get lunch before we head back?" Elena's heart did something complicated in her chest. This wasn't ranch business. This was Rhett asking her to share a meal in town, in public, where people would see them together and draw conclusions. "I'd like that," she said. The restaurant was small and warm, with checkered tablecloths and the smell of frying meat. They sat at a corner table, and Elena realized with a start that this was the first time she'd eaten a meal she hadn't prepared herself in over 4 months. The food was good, roast chicken and potatoes and green beans that someone else had cooked. But better than the food was the conversation. They talked about the ranch, about spring plans, about Birch's healing and Wade's terrible jokes, and the time Davis had accidentally branded himself trying to show off. They talked about books they'd read and places they'd been, and the strange paths that had brought them both to this frozen corner of nowhere. Rhett told her about growing up in Texas, about learning to work cattle before he could ride properly, about coming north to escape a father who drank too much and hit too hard. Elena told him about Philadelphia, about her parents dying young, and her sister marrying well and Thomas's charm that had hidden weakness until it was too late to escape. She told him about the debts and the auction and the particular humiliation of watching strangers pick through your life like it was garbage. "I thought I'd die in that city," she said quietly. "Not dramatically, just slowly, working as a servant in my sister's house until I was too old to be useful. Coming west felt like throwing dice, but at least it was a choice I made instead of one that was made for me." "I'm glad you made it," Rhett said. "I can't imagine the ranch without you anymore." The words were simple, but the weight behind them wasn't. Elena met his eyes across the table and saw everything he wasn't saying: the loneliness, the slow thawing of a heart that had been frozen for years, the cautious hope that maybe it wasn't too late for a different kind of life. "Rhett," she said carefully, "what are we doing here?" "Eating lunch." "You know that's not what I mean." He was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing patterns on the tablecloth. "I don't know," he finally admitted. "I just know that when I'm with you, things feel less heavy, like maybe the future doesn't have to be the same as the past." Elena's throat was tight. "I feel that too." "But you're scared." "Terrified." She tried to smile. "I made one bad choice with a man, and it cost me everything. The idea of doing it again—" "I'm not Thomas," Rhett said, and there was steel in his voice. "I don't gamble. I don't drink beyond a glass on special occasions, and I've never raised my hand to anyone who didn't deserve it. I know I'm not what anyone would call easy, but I'm honest and I'm loyal, and if I make a promise, I keep it. I know that. I do. But knowing doesn't make the fear go away." "Then we go slow," Rhett said. "We figure this out as we go, no pressure, no expectations. And if you decide it's not what you want, I'll respect that. You'll always have a place at Iron Vale for as long as you want it, no matter what happens between us. You have my word on that." It was exactly the right thing to say. Elena felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of tension she hadn't realized she was carrying. "Slow sounds good," she said. They finished their meal and headed back to the ranch as the afternoon light was starting to fail. The ride was quiet but comfortable, and when Rhett helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingered on her waist just a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you," Elena said, "for lunch, for everything." "Thank you for saying yes." That night, Elena sat in the kitchen after everyone else had gone to bed, working on cutting out the blue fabric by lamplight. She thought about Rhett's hands on her waist, about his promise to go slow, about the careful way they were building toward something neither of them quite dared to name yet. She thought about Thomas, about the years she'd wasted trying to fix a man who didn't want to be fixed, about her sister's pity and the Philadelphia society that had dropped her the moment she stopped being useful. And she thought about Iron Vale Ranch, about men who worked hard and ate her food with gratitude, about a kitchen that felt like home, about a future that was hers to shape instead of one that was shaped around her. The door opened and Red appeared, looking sheepish. "Saw the light. Couldn't sleep?" Just working on this. She held up the partially cut fabric. May I? He gestured to the chair across from her. Of course. He sat and watched her work in comfortable silence. After a while, he said, I've been thinking about what you said, about being scared. Rhett, let me finish. He leaned forward. I'm scared too. I loved Margaret with everything I had, and when I lost her, it nearly killed me. I've spent 4 years convinced that loving anyone again would be a betrayal of her memory, but lately I've been wondering if the real betrayal is refusing to live just because she can't. Elena set down her scissors. What are you saying? I'm saying I care about you. More than I should, probably, considering you've only been here a few months. I'm saying when I think about the future now, you're in it. And I'm saying that scares the hell out of me, but I'm willing to be scared if you are. Her hands were shaking. I don't know how to do this, Rhett. I don't know how to trust this. Neither do I. He reached across the table and took her hand. So we figure it out together, one day at a time. No promises we can't keep, no expectations we can't meet. Just honest work at being honest with each other. Elena looked down at their joined hands, his scarred and calloused from years of hard labor, hers reddened from kitchen work and cold. Two people who'd been broken by life and put themselves back together wrong, trying to find a way forward that didn't repeat old mistakes. One day at a time, she said. I can do that. Good. He squeezed her hand and stood. Get some sleep, Elena. Tomorrow's going to be another long day. They're all long days out here. True, but they're better with you in them. He left her then, and Elena sat alone with her fabric and her thoughts. Outside, the wind was picking up again, but the kitchen was warm and the stove was burning steady, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Elena felt something dangerous blooming in her chest. Hope. She finished cutting the fabric and went to bed, and that night she dreamed of spring. Spring came slowly to Ironvale Ranch, the snow retreating in grudging inches, leaving behind mud and the smell of thawing earth. The days grew longer, the work more demanding, and Elena found herself caught in a rhythm that felt less like endurance and more like belonging. She finished the blue dress in late March, sitting by lamplight after the kitchen was clean, her fingers aching from the close work. It wasn't fancy, just a simple work dress with a fitted bodice and practical skirt, but it was hers, made by her own hands, the first new thing she'd owned in years that wasn't born from necessity. She wore it to Sunday supper, feeling self-conscious in a way she hadn't since girlhood. The men noticed immediately. Davis whistled low until Wade smacked him upside the head, and Coleman nodded with what might have been approval on his weathered face. Rhett didn't say anything at all, but his eyes found hers across the room and held, and the look in them made her forget how to breathe for a moment. Later, when the men had gone and she was washing dishes, he appeared in the kitchen doorway. The dress suits you, he said quietly. Thank you. I like seeing you wear something that makes you happy. Elena set down the plate she was drying and turned to face him. Rhett, we need to talk about what's happening between us. His expression went cautious. All right, the men are starting to notice. Wade's been giving me looks, and I heard Davis making comments to Birch. It's only a matter of time before this becomes ranch gossip, and I need to know what you want me to say when people ask. Rhett was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working like he was chewing on words he didn't know how to swallow. Finally, he said, What do you want to say? I asked you first. Elena, no. She crossed her arms. I've spent my whole life letting men decide what my future looked like. Thomas decided we'd live beyond our means. His business partner decided I'd lose the house. Even coming here, I was accepting what you offered because I had no other choice. But this, whatever this is between us, I need to have a say in it. I need to know it's something we're building together, not something that's just happening to me. His face softened. You're right. I'm sorry. I've been taking things slow because I thought that's what you needed, but I haven't been clear about what I want. So tell me, what do you want? Rhett took a breath, and when he spoke, his voice was steady and sure. I want you to stay. Not as hired help, but as my partner. I want to wake up knowing you're in this house, in this life, by choice and not obligation. I want to build something with you that isn't just survival, something that feels like actually living. He paused. And when you're ready, when you trust this enough to believe it's real, I want to marry you. Make it official. Give you a claim to this ranch that can't be taken away. Yes, also. Elena's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. That's a lot. I know, and I'm not asking for an answer now. I'm just telling you what I want so you can decide what you want without having to guess what I'm thinking. What if what I want scares you? Try me. She took a breath, choosing her words carefully. I want to believe this is real. I want to trust that you won't wake up one day and realize you made a mistake, that you were just lonely and I was convenient. I want to stop waiting for the other shoe to drop, but I don't know how to do that when every instinct I have says that nothing good lasts. Rhett crossed the room and took her hands in his. I can't promise you that nothing bad will ever happen. Life out here is too hard for that. But I can promise you that I won't be the thing that breaks. I won't gamble away our future or drink myself stupid or decide one day that I'm bored and want something else. This ranch is my life, and if you become part of it, that's a permanent decision as far as I'm concerned. How can you be sure? Because I already lost the thing I loved most in this world, and it taught me not to waste time on anything I'm not serious about. I don't have the energy for games or casual feelings. If I'm standing here telling you I want you in my life, it's because I've thought it through from every angle, and the answer keeps coming out the same. Elena looked up at him, at this hard, scarred man who'd learned to be gentle with her in ways he probably didn't even realize. She thought about the months of slow building, of conversations over coffee and shared work, and the careful way he'd given her space to breathe while making it clear she was wanted. I need time, she said quietly. Not because I don't care about you, but because I need to trust my own judgment again. I made one bad choice and paid for it for 17 years. I can't do that again. Take all the time you need. I'll be here. He kissed her forehead, gentle and chaste, and left her standing in the kitchen with her hands still warm from his touch and her mind spinning with possibilities she was almost brave enough to believe in. The ranch exploded into activity as April arrived. Calving season hit hard and fast, and suddenly there were newborn cattle everywhere, wobbly-legged and vulnerable, requiring constant attention. Rhett hired on 4 extra hands, which meant Elena was cooking for 16 men instead of 12, and the kitchen became a non-stop operation of bread and stew and coffee. She barely saw Rhett during those weeks. He was up before dawn and didn't come back until long after dark, catching sleep in brief snatches between emergencies. When he did appear in the kitchen, he was covered in mud and exhaustion, gulping down food too fast to taste it before heading back out. But he always found a moment to catch her eye, to touch her hand in passing, small gestures that said he hadn't forgotten what they'd talked about, even if there was no time to pursue it. Elena threw herself into the work, finding satisfaction in the sheer volume of what needed doing. She made friends with the new hands, a quiet man named Garrett, who never spoke unless directly addressed, and 3 younger men who were greener than spring grass but willing to learn. She kept everyone fed, kept the kitchen spotless, and discovered she had a talent for organizing chaos into something manageable. Wade watched her with increasing amusement. "You're running this place like a military operation," he said one morning while she was coordinating meal times around the work schedule. "Someone has to," Elena said. "Otherwise you'd all starve to death standing in line." Margaret used to do the same thing, had charts and schedules for everything. His expression went distant. Drove Colson crazy at first, but he learned to appreciate it. Structure makes hard things easier. "Did you know her well?" "Well enough. She was a good woman, just not built for this life, too soft, too trusting. The frontier ate her alive from the inside until there wasn't enough left to survive childbirth." He looked at Elena directly. "You're different. You've got steel in you. That's what this place needs." Elena thought about that conversation later, while she was kneading bread dough with more force than necessary. Margaret Colson had tried to bring civilization to the wilderness and had been destroyed by it. Elena had no illusions about bringing civilization anywhere. She was just trying to carve out a space where people could do hard work without losing their humanity in the process. Maybe that was enough. The crisis came on a Tuesday in late April. Elena was preparing the noon meal when she heard shouting from the direction of the south pasture, followed by the sound of running footsteps. She looked out the window to see men sprinting toward the barn, and her stomach dropped. She was out the door before she thought about it, running across the muddy yard in her kitchen apron. She found chaos at the barn, men shouting, a horse screaming in pain, and in the middle of it all, Rhett lying motionless on the ground. "What happened?" she demanded, dropping to her knees beside him. "Horse threw him," Garrett said, his voice tight with fear. "Landed wrong." Rhett's eyes were closed, his face white under the dirt, and there was blood in his hair. Elena forced herself to stay calm, to think like she had with Birch, like she'd done 100 times with Thomas. Check for breathing, steady, pulse, strong, head wound, bad but not catastrophic. Get him inside, she ordered. Carefully, support his head and neck. Wade, send someone to town for the doctor. Everyone else back to work. Standing around won't help. They carried Rhett into the house and laid him on his bed. Elena cleaned the wound, a gash above his temple that had bled dramatically but wasn't as deep as she'd feared, and bandaged it with hands that shook only slightly. Then she sat beside him and waited. He woke an hour later, disoriented and in pain. What? You got thrown. Hit your head. Lie still. The horse is fine. You're not. Stay down. He tried to sit up anyway and immediately went pale. Elena pushed him back against the pillows with more force than necessary. I said stay down. You probably have a concussion, and if you stand up too fast, you'll pass out and hit your head again. Don't be stupid. Elena? No, you don't get to argue. For once in your life, you're going to lie still and let someone else take care of you. Something in her voice must have gotten through because he stopped fighting and sank back against the pillows. The ranch, Wade's handling it. Everything's under control. She dipped a cloth in cool water and pressed it against his forehead. You're not indispensable, Rhett. The world will keep turning for a few days without you running yourself into the ground. Feels wrong, not working. Get used to it. Doctor's on his way from town, and you're on bed rest until he says otherwise. Rhett closed his eyes. You're terrifying when you're being practical. Good. Someone needs to scare some sense into you. She sat with him while he drifted in and out of sleep, watching his chest rise and fall, feeling the weight of how close it had been. A different angle, a harder impact, and she could have lost him before they'd even figured out what they were to each other. The doctor arrived late that afternoon. A competent man in his 60s who examined Rhett thoroughly and confirmed Elena's diagnosis. Concussion, but not severe. Keep him quiet for a week, watch for dizziness or nausea, and don't let him do anything stupid. The doctor looked at Elena. Can you manage that? I'll tie him to the bed if I have to. The doctor laughed. I believe you would. He's lucky to have you, Mrs. Mercer. After the doctor left, Elena made soup and forced Rhett to eat it, then sat in the rocking chair by his bed with her mending, refusing to leave. You don't have to stay, Rhett said quietly. Yes, I do. Why? Elena set down her mending and looked at him directly. Because when I saw you lying there, I thought you were dead. And in that moment, I realized I couldn't stand the idea of losing you. So yes, I'm staying, and you're going to rest, and we're both going to be grateful you're alive to complain about it. Rhett was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I love you, Elena Mercer. I should have said it before now, but I'm saying it now. I love you, and I want to spend whatever time I have left making sure you know it. Elena's eyes burned. That's the concussion talking. It's not. I've wanted to say it for weeks. I just didn't know how. But lying there thinking I might die before I got the chance, I'm not making that mistake again. She crossed to the bed and sat on the edge, taking his hand. I love you too. And it scares me to death, but I'm tired of being scared. I'm tired of waiting for disaster. If this is real, if you mean it, then I want it. I want you. I mean it. Then when you're healed, when the doctor says you're recovered, ask me again. Ask me properly. Elena, I'm serious. Ask me when you're not concussed and I'm not terrified. Ask me when we can both think clearly and make a real decision. Rhett smiled, and despite the bandage and the pain he was in, it was the most genuine expression she'd ever seen on his face. All right, but you should know, I'm not changing my mind. Neither am I. She stayed with him that night, dozing in the rocking chair, waking every hour to check on him. And when the dawn light finally crept through the window, she looked at him sleeping peacefully and thought about futures and choices and the strange paths that led people to exactly where they needed to be. The week that followed was difficult in ways Elena hadn't anticipated. Rhett was a terrible patient, constantly trying to get up and work despite her orders, and she found herself in the strange position of being both his nurse and the person running the ranch by proxy. Wade helped, translating her decisions into orders the men would follow, and to her surprise, they did follow them. When she said to focus on the north pasture, they focused there. When she reorganized the work schedule to maximize efficiency, they adapted without complaint. You're good at this, Wade told her on the third day. Running things, making decisions. I'm just doing what needs doing. That's what leadership is, seeing what needs doing and making sure it gets done. On the seventh day, the doctor returned, examined Rhett, and declared him fit to resume light duties. Rhett was out of bed immediately, and Elena had to physically block the door to keep him from sprinting to the barn. Light duties, she reminded him. That means no heavy lifting, no breaking horses, no working yourself into exhaustion. Understood? Yes, ma'am. I'm serious, Rhett. You push too hard too fast and you'll set yourself back. He pulled her close, careful of his still healing ribs. I know, and I'm grateful you're here to keep me from being stupid. He kissed her softly. But I need to ask you something, and I'd like to do it without you worrying about my health. Elena's heart started racing. All right. He stepped back and took both her hands in his. Elena Mercer, I'm standing here fully healed and thinking clearly, and I'm asking you to marry me. Not because you're convenient or because I'm lonely, but because you make my life better in every way that matters. You make this ranch a home instead of just a place to work. You make me want to be more than just a man surviving until he dies. You make me believe the future can be different than the past. Elena felt tears sliding down her cheeks. That's not a question. Right, sorry. He took a breath. Elena Mercer, will you marry me? She thought about Philadelphia, about Thomas, about arriving at this ranch with nothing but desperation and $17. She thought about learning to cook on a temperamental stove, about setting Birch's broken leg, about bringing curtains down from the attic, and watching this cold place slowly warm. She thought about Rhett standing vigil over an injured kid, about the way he'd mourned his wife while learning to live again, about the careful way he'd given Elena space to heal even when it cost him. Yes, she said. Yes, I'll marry you. He kissed her properly then, and Elena kissed him back, tasting salt and hope, and the beginning of something she was finally brave enough to believe in. They were married 3 weeks later in the main room of the ranch house. No fancy ceremony, no elaborate preparations, just Wade standing up as witness, the ranch hands cleaned up in their best clothes, and a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through Blackthorn Ridge. Elena wore her blue dress with Margaret's pearls. Rhett had insisted she take them from the trunk upstairs, saying his first wife would have wanted her to have something beautiful for her wedding day. Her hands shook when she spoke her vows, but her voice was steady. Rhett's voice shook when he said, I do, and Elena loved him more for the vulnerability of it. They had a celebration that night, a real one, with fiddle music that Coleman produced from somewhere, and dancing in the yard despite the mud. Someone had made a cake that was lopsided but tasted like butter and happiness. The men toasted them with whiskey and beer, and even Wade smiled, really smiled, for the first time Elena had seen. Speech, Davis called out. The boss has to make a speech. Rhett stood reluctantly, pulling Elena up beside him. I'm not good at speeches, he said, but I want you all to know that this woman saved more than my life when she came here. She saved this ranch. She made it a place worth coming home to instead of just a place to work until you die. She turned a group of men into a family, and I'm grateful every day that she chose to stay. The men cheered, and Elena hid her face in Rhett's shoulder, overwhelmed by the emotion of it all. Later, when the party had wound down and the men had stumbled back to the bunkhouse, Elena and Rhett stood together on the porch, watching stars emerge in the vast prairie sky. You happy? Rhett asked quietly. Terrified, Elena admitted. But yes, happy. Good, me too. They went inside together, into a house that was finally warm, finally lived in, finally a home instead of a monument to grief. The months that followed were the hardest Elena had ever worked, and the happiest she could remember being. The ranch demanded everything. Calving season bled into branding, branding into summer hay cutting, an endless cycle of labor that left everyone exhausted and satisfied. But now Elena wasn't just the cook. She was Rhett's wife, his partner, and slowly the men started bringing their problems to her as well as to him. Garrett wanted advice about a girl in town. Davis needed someone to explain how to write a letter to his mother back east. Birch, now fully healed, asked if she thought he should stay at the ranch long-term or try his luck further west. She listened to them all, gave advice when she had it, and honest ignorance when she didn't, and watched the ranch transform from a collection of employees into something that felt like chosen family. Wade remained her closest ally, teaching her the business side of ranching, how to read the books, when to sell cattle. how to negotiate with buyers. "You need to know this," he said one afternoon while they were going over accounts. "Colson's not a young man anymore, and neither am I. Someday this ranch will be your responsibility. Better you learn now while you've got help." That's morbid thinking. That's practical thinking. Rhett's already healthier and happier than he's been in years, which means he'll probably live to be 90 just to spite everyone. But knowing how things work gives you power, and power gives you choices. The trouble with Sutter came to a head in August. His men appeared again, 6 riders like before, but this time they didn't bother with courtesy. They rode straight onto ranch property, cut a fence line, and scattered a small herd of cattle before riding off. Rhett was ready to ride after them immediately, but Elena stopped him. "That's what they want," she said. "They want you angry and stupid so you'll do something that gives them an excuse to claim self-defense when they shoot you." "So what do? We document everything, we report it to the marshal, and we make sure we're never caught unprepared. Wade, I want armed watches on the property line 24 hours a day. Rotate the men so nobody gets too tired. Davis, you're the best shot. I want you positioned where you can see anyone approaching from the east, and someone rides to town today to file a complaint." The men stared at her. Then Wade started laughing. "You heard the lady. Move." They moved. The marshal came out 2 days later, looked at the cut fence and the scattered cattle, and promised to have words with Sutter. It wasn't much, but it was official notice that Ironvale Ranch wasn't going to roll over. Sutter tried twice more. Once with a false claim that Rhett's cattle had damaged his property, once with an offer to buy that was really a threat dressed up legal. Both times, Elena insisted they respond through proper channels, using lawyers and documentation instead of violence. "You're smarter than me," Rhett told her after the second incident. "I would have just shot him." "And ended up in jail, leaving me to run this place alone." "No thank you." The fight went on for months, a war of patience and paperwork that tested everyone's nerves. But Elena had learned something in Philadelphia, that men with power expected you to fight the way they fought, and sometimes the smartest move was to refuse to play their game. Eventually, Sutter gave up. His resources were stretched thin trying to intimidate multiple ranches, and Ironvale was proving too organized and too well defended to be worth the effort. He moved on to easier targets, and the threat faded into background noise. Winter came again, Elena's second at the ranch, and this time she wasn't fighting to survive. She was settled, secure, surrounded by people who respected her, and a husband who loved her in quiet, steady ways that felt more real than any romance novel had promised. On Christmas Eve, she cooked a feast: roasted beef and potatoes and bread stuffing, apple pie and cinnamon cake. Everything she'd learned to make with the ranch's limited resources transformed into something special. The men ate like they'd never seen food before, and afterward they sat around the fire telling stories and singing songs that were probably older than the country itself. Rhett pulled her close, his arm around her waist, and whispered, "Thank you for all of this. You've thanked me 100 times. I'll thank you 100 more. You changed my life, Elena. Gave me a reason to care about the future instead of just surviving until the past stopped hurting." She kissed him, soft and sweet, not caring that the men could see. "You gave me the same thing, a place to belong, a life that's mine." Later that night, lying in their bed while wind rattled the windows and the house creaked around them, Elena thought about the journey that had brought her here, about losing everything and traveling west with nothing but desperate hope, about the $17 in her pocket and the certainty that she was out of chances. She thought about the woman she'd been, worn down by grief and debt and the particular despair that comes from being powerless in your own life. And she thought about the woman she'd become, competent, confident, building a future instead of just accepting whatever future happened to her. "What are you thinking about?" Rhett asked sleepily. "That I'm glad I came here. Even when it was terrifying, even when I thought I'd fail, I'm glad I took the chance." "Me too." He pulled her closer. "Best decision I ever made, hiring you." "Second best," Elena corrected. "Best decision was asking me to stay." "Fair point." She fell asleep wrapped in his arms, safe and warm and home in a way she'd never been anywhere else. Spring returned, the cycle beginning again, and Elena found herself standing in the kitchen one morning watching the sunrise over the prairie and feeling something she'd thought she'd lost forever: joy. Simple, uncomplicated joy at being alive and healthy and surrounded by purpose. Wade found her there, standing at the window with coffee in her hands and a slight smile on her face. Thinking deep thoughts? He asked. Just grateful thoughts. You've earned the right to them. This place was dying when you arrived. Now it's alive again. That's your doing. It's all our doing, you, Rhett, the men, everyone working together. Wade shook his head. You can be modest if you want, but I know what I saw. A ranch full of ghosts and a man who'd forgotten how to live. You brought both back from the dead. Elena thought about that as she went about her day, cooking and cleaning and managing the endless details of keeping 16 people fed and functional. She thought about Margaret Colson, who'd tried to tame the frontier and been broken by it, about Rhett, who'd survived loss by refusing to feel anything at all. And she thought about herself, about the particular strength that came from having lost everything once and learning that you could survive it, could rebuild, could find meaning in the ruins. The frontier didn't break everyone. Sometimes it forged them into something harder and more resilient than they'd been before. Sometimes it taught you that survival wasn't the same as living, and that choosing to live, really live, with all the risk and pain that came with it, was the bravest thing a person could do. Elena had arrived at Iron Vale Ranch expecting to survive. Instead, she'd learned to thrive. And in teaching Rhett to do the same, she'd discovered something that no one could take from her. The knowledge that she was strong enough to build a life on her own terms, even in the harshest country in the world. That was worth more than all the money Thomas had gambled away, more than the house she'd lost, more than the years she'd spent making do with less than she deserved. This life, this ranch, this family she'd chosen and who'd chosen her back, this was worth everything. She was still thinking about it that evening when Rhett found her on the porch, watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and purple. Beautiful, he said, slipping his arm around her waist. It is. I was talking about you. Elena laughed and leaned into him. You're getting sentimental in your old age. Maybe. Or maybe I'm just finally smart enough to say what I'm thinking. He kissed the top of her head. I love you, Elena Colson. Thank you for taking a chance on a broken-down rancher and his dying ranch. Thank you for giving me a reason to stay. They stood together as the sun sank below the horizon and the stars began to emerge. Two people who'd found each other in the middle of nowhere and built something worth keeping. And when they finally went inside, into the warm, lived-in house that had once been so cold and empty, Elena thought about how strange life was, how the worst moments could lead to the best ones if you were brave enough to keep going. She'd lost everything in Philadelphia, but here, in this brutal, beautiful country, she'd found something better than anything she'd left behind. She'd found herself, and in doing so, she'd found home.